the tensions begin to rise. The flight from Atlanta to New York City had started as a typical journey, with the hum of engines and the soft chatter of passengers in the cabin. It was a busy Monday morning, and the atmosphere was a blend of excitement and exhaustion as many of the travelers had their minds set on business meetings, conferences, or reunions in the city. Among them was a woman who sat in the first-class section, her presence quiet yet commanding. Elaine Patterson, an elegant, poised figure in her mid-40s, settled into her seat, adjusting the folds of her emerald green Valentino dress. A sleek Louis Vuitton tote sat at her side, and her fingers hovered over a legal brief she had been reviewing for the past few days. The upcoming judicial conference in New York was important, and though she had a packed schedule ahead, she always found moments of stillness, like this one, where she could collect her thoughts and focus before the whirlwind of meetings began. Elaine had lived a life that few could imagine. She had earned her place as one of the most respected and powerful figures in the nation, a Supreme Court justice, known for her fairness, intellect, and unwavering dedication to justice. But despite her high-profile status, she preferred the quiet anonymity of everyday life. She valued discretion, blending in with the crowd, and never sought the spotlight, even when the weight of her decisions was felt across the country. As a mother, a wife, and a woman of great influence, Elaine had learned early on the importance of maintaining grace and composure, even in the most trying circumstances. And she did so effortlessly, even on this flight. The flight attendant, Amanda Walsh, noticed Elaine as she made her way down the aisle. She was young, in her mid-20s, with blonde hair tied back in a neat ponytail and a perfectly pressed uniform. She walked with an air of authority, but it was clear from the start that Amanda's gaze lingered on Elaine in a way that was uncomfortable. Her eyes were cold and calculating as she scanned the passengers in first class, her judgment already passing over some, including Elaine. "Ma'am, I believe you're sitting in the wrong seat," Amanda said, her voice sharp and dismissive, as if she had already decided that this woman did not belong there. She did not look at Elaine as a person but as an inconvenience, something that had disrupted the natural order of her world. Elaine looked up calmly from her brief, meeting the flight attendant's gaze without hesitation. "This is my seat," she replied evenly, offering her boarding pass without a hint of irritation. Amanda's lips curled into a slight sneer, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features. She glanced at the ticket, then back at Elaine, her eyes narrowing. "First class is reserved for certain passengers," she muttered under her breath, as if questioning whether Elaine had earned the right to sit in such a place. Elaine's face remained serene, the practiced composure of a woman who had been in far more high-stakes environments than this one. She had heard the subtle undertones of the flight attendant's voice, the unmistakable judgment lacing her words. But she didn't let it bother her. She had dealt with much worse in her life, after all. "I am aware of that," she said simply, her voice carrying a quiet authority that could not be mistaken. Amanda, visibly irritated by the interaction, turned away, her shoulders stiff as she moved to tend to other passengers. Elaine, meanwhile, returned to her legal brief, her mind already shifting back to the work ahead. But the tension in the air had not dissipated. The other passengers, most of whom were seated in business class or economy, had noticed the exchange and now watched, unsure of what was happening. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others quietly returned to their own business, but the atmosphere had subtly shifted. Elaine could feel the weight of their gazes on her. It was a strange feeling, being scrutinized, but it was nothing new. Her life had been built on being under the microscope, her every decision examined and dissected by the public. Yet in this moment, it was different. This was not the critical eye of a reporter or a colleague. No, this was something more insidious, a quiet form of judgment, one based not on her abilities but on her appearance, her race, and the assumptions others had about her. As the plane cruised steadily toward New York, Amanda's behavior only became more apparent. Elaine noticed that the flight attendant had begun to deliberately ignore her requests. When she asked for a glass of water, Amanda passed by her seat without a word, attending to others, and only after a moment did another attendant, a more seasoned woman named Rachel, approached with the requested drink, offering a polite apology for Amanda's behavior. "I'm terribly sorry for that, ma'am. It's unacceptable," Rachel said, her tone warm and sincere. Elaine smiled faintly, accepting the drink with a quiet nod, though it was clear that the situation was beginning to escalate in a way that she had not anticipated. "Thank you, Rachel," Elaine said, her voice calm, though she could feel her patience thinning. She had learned long ago that kindness was often the best response to hostility, but even the most practiced people had their limits. For Elaine, this flight, meant to be a quiet interlude before the whirlwind of meetings, was quickly turning into something far more uncomfortable. As the plane continued its journey, Elaine decided to let the matter go. There was no point in making a scene. She would soon be in New York, and the ordeal would be behind her. But fate had other plans. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, signaling that passengers were free to move about the cabin, Elaine decided to take the opportunity to use the restroom. She stood from her seat, smoothing the fabric of her dress as she made her way down the aisle. As she passed Amanda, the flight attendant's eyes narrowed again, this time more visibly. "Excuse me," Amanda called out, her voice loud enough for the other passengers to hear. "Passengers like you shouldn't be wandering around first class like you own the place," she spat, her words dripping with disdain. The cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence. Elaine stopped, taken aback by the hostility in the flight attendant's tone. She had expected some measure of professionalism, even if the woman was uncomfortable with her presence, but this was something else entirely. Elaine squared her shoulders, her voice as calm and steady as it had been throughout the entire exchange. "I'm simply heading to the restroom, as I'm entitled to do," she said firmly, her eyes locking with Amanda's. Amanda smirked, clearly enjoying the discomfort she was causing. "Next time, try coach. That's where you belong," she sneered. A gasp rippled through the cabin as the other passengers heard the words. Elaine's heart rate quickened, but she refused to let her composure slip. She was not about to let this woman get the better of her, not today. "I will return to my seat after I've used the facilities, as I am entitled to," she said, standing her ground. Amanda's face flushed red, but she did not respond, only watched with barely concealed fury as Elaine walked past her and toward the restroom. The tension in the cabin was palpable now, and every eye seemed to be trained on the exchange. But as Elaine entered the restroom, she could only hope that the situation would end there. But little did she know, the worst was yet to come. The hostility escalates. Elaine Patterson stepped out of the restroom, a quiet determination in her step. The flight had been uneventful until now, and she hoped that she could simply return to her seat, settle in, and avoid any further unpleasantness. As she made her way back down the aisle, the tension in the air felt thicker than before. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, many of them awkwardly pretending not to notice the standoff between her and the flight attendant, Amanda. Elaine's gaze flickered briefly toward the front of the plane, where the cabin crew was preparing for the descent into New York. She was used to being under scrutiny in her career. Being a Supreme Court justice meant that your every move was analyzed, dissected, and often criticized. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't about her intellect, her rulings, or her position in the country. No, this felt personal, rooted in something far more dangerous than a simple misunderstanding. As she approached her seat, Elaine saw Amanda standing there, arms crossed and eyes locked on her. The young flight attendant's posture was almost confrontational, her lips tight with disdain. The moment Elaine reached her seat, Amanda moved forward, blocking her from sitting down. "Excuse me, ma'am," Amanda said, her voice carrying a tone that bordered on defiance. "We've had complaints about your luggage. I'm afraid I'll need to inspect it." Elaine paused, the brief flicker of irritation flashing across her face. This was getting out of hand. She had already complied with all the flight regulations, and her bag was secured according to the rules. Still, she took a breath, reminding herself that she would handle this with grace. My bag is secured and complies with all regulations, Elaine said, her voice measured and calm. There's no need for further inspection. But Amanda was not about to back down. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips curled into an almost smug smile. She leaned in, her voice laced with barely concealed hostility. Are you refusing to comply with a flight crew member's directive? She demanded, her tone sharp, almost mocking. Elaine's patience, which had held steady throughout the flight, was beginning to fray at the edges. She had dealt with difficult people before, especially during her years on the bench. But this felt different. Amanda wasn't just being unprofessional, she was being deliberately antagonistic, and Elaine could sense the underlying prejudices in her words and actions. I'm not refusing, Elaine said quietly, though her tone had shifted slightly, taking on a firmness that matched the steel of her character. But I don't believe this inspection is necessary. I've followed all the guidelines. Before Elaine could finish her sentence, Amanda, in an almost calculated move, yanked Elaine's Louis Vuitton tote bag from the overhead bin. The sudden, forceful action caused the strap of Elaine's dress to catch on the bag, and in an instant, the delicate fabric ripped, a loud tearing sound echoing through the cabin. Gasps rippled through the passengers, and the cabin seemed to go still, as if everyone was holding their breath. Elaine instinctively reached for the torn fabric, clutching it to her chest as a wave of humiliation washed over her. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sting of being treated with such disrespect. She felt exposed, not just physically, but emotionally. The act wasn't just a mistake, it was deliberate, a clear act of aggression. Amanda had crossed a line, and she knew it. For a moment, Elaine stood frozen, her breath steadying as she fought to maintain her composure. The rip in her dress was not just a wardrobe malfunction, it symbolized something far deeper, a blatant disregard for her dignity, her authority, and the respect she was entitled to as a person. But Elaine was no stranger to challenges, no stranger to having her integrity tested. She had spent her life fighting for justice, not only in the courtroom but in the world, where too many people had tried to tear her down for reasons that had nothing to do with her qualifications or abilities. Elaine stood tall, looking Amanda square in the eye. She didn't flinch. That was unnecessary, she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of someone who had been wronged. Amanda looked momentarily taken aback, but the hostility didn't leave her expression. She stepped back, clearly satisfied with the chaos she had caused. Maybe you should learn to keep your things in order, Amanda shot back, though there was a certain smugness in her voice, as if she had somehow won. Elaine felt the eyes of the passengers on her, the stares filled with a mix of disbelief and discomfort. She could sense the unease in the cabin, and while part of her wanted to snap, to lash out and demand an apology, she knew that she couldn't. She was above this petty confrontation. She was not going to let Amanda, or anyone else, bring her down to this level. But that didn't mean she was going to let the matter slide. I would appreciate it if you would allow me to return to my seat and for you to bring me a manager, Elaine said firmly, her voice laced with authority. This situation is unacceptable. Amanda, who had been standing there with a smug look on her face, faltered for a moment. Her eyes flickered toward the other passengers, and for the first time, she seemed to sense the collective judgment of the people around her. It was clear that she had underestimated the woman she had just humiliated. Instead of backing down, Amanda simply turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the aisle. Elaine felt a brief flash of relief, but she didn't allow herself to relax just yet. She had dealt with difficult people her entire life, but this was different. This was about respect, about treating each person with dignity, no matter their background, their status, or their appearance. Elaine returned to her seat, smoothing the fabric of her dress as best as she could, but the damage was done. The rip in the dress, a symbol of her loss of dignity in this moment, was just the beginning of something much larger. The whispers had begun again among the passengers. Some were sympathetic, others were uncertain, but all of them had witnessed the confrontation. The tension in the cabin had become unbearable. As the plane continued its flight, Elaine could feel her mind spinning. Her thoughts weren't on her legal briefs or her upcoming conference anymore. No, her focus was on what had just happened, and what she was going to do about it. She was a Supreme Court justice, a woman who had dedicated her life to upholding the law and fighting for fairness, but this? This was personal. And the world would soon learn that Justice Elaine Patterson didn't back down from a fight. The turning point. As the plane continued its journey toward New York, the weight of the moment settled heavily on Elaine Patterson's shoulders. Her thoughts were a storm of clarity and resolve. She had been disrespected, not only as a passenger but as a person. The rip in her dress, though a small thing in the grand scheme of life, symbolized so much more. It represented the way society so often dismissed those they didn't understand, overlooked those who didn't fit a certain mold, and assumed that those in power would always remain untouchable. Elaine wasn't just a judge. She was a symbol of perseverance, of dignity in the face of systemic oppression. And as she sat there, gripping the armrest of her seat, she knew that she couldn't allow this incident to pass without addressing it. But more than that, she knew she couldn't allow Amanda's behavior to be swept under the rug. Despite the rip in her dress, despite the discomfort and the anger bubbling inside her, Elaine's calm exterior remained unshaken. She had a job to do, and that job, whether on the bench or in her daily life, was to stand for justice, to ensure that no one, no matter their status, had to endure the kind of treatment she had just experienced. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning a personal battle. This was about making sure that those in positions of authority understood the impact their words and actions had on others. As the plane's descent began, Elaine could feel the cabin tense up again. She had remained composed, but she sensed that the passengers, those who had witnessed the entire confrontation, were quietly wondering what would happen next. Would she just sit there in silence, allowing Amanda's rude behavior to go unchallenged? Or would she take action? Elaine had always believed that one of the most powerful things a person could do in the face of injustice was to speak up. She had fought for civil rights and equality her entire life. She had risen above obstacles, shattered ceilings, and paved the way for future generations of women and minorities. She wasn't going to let someone's petty prejudice undermine everything she had worked for. As the plane touched down on the runway, Elaine stood from her seat with a quiet determination. Her actions spoke louder than words. She walked down the aisle with purpose, her gaze straight ahead, even as Amanda's eyes followed her with a mix of defiance and apprehension. The other passengers began to whisper once more, their curiosity piqued. Some of them had no doubt already recognized her. Justice Elaine Patterson was an iconic figure, after all, but she hadn't come here for the spotlight. She had come to make sure that this injustice would not go unnoticed. Elaine approached the front of the plane where the head flight attendant, Sarah, was standing near the cockpit, preparing for the disembarkation process. Elaine's stride was firm, each step sending a clear message to anyone who might be watching. "I will not be silenced." "Excuse me," Elaine said, her voice clear and authoritative as she approached Sarah. The flight attendant turned to her, her eyes widening as recognition dawned. Sarah had been working this flight for several hours, and the passengers' murmurs about the tension between Elaine and Amanda hadn't escaped her notice. But seeing Elaine now, in person, standing tall and unwavering, Sarah knew she was dealing with someone far more significant than she had imagined. "Yes, ma'am. How can I assist you?" Sarah asked, her voice strained as she tried to remain professional, though she couldn't hide the slight tremor in her tone. "I need to speak with your supervisor immediately," Elaine said, her words precise and deliberate. "It's a matter of serious concern." The head flight attendant nodded quickly, clearly recognizing the gravity of the situation. "Of course. Let me just get Captain Roberts and the gate supervisor for you," she said, her demeanor shifting as she recognized the urgency in Elaine's voice. Elaine stepped aside, waiting in the narrow aisle, her posture still dignified. Her mind raced as she considered what to say when she was face to face with the airline staff. This wasn't just about a torn dress. It was about the treatment of an individual based on assumptions, prejudice, and bias. She wasn't the first woman to be treated this way, nor would she be the last. But if she had the power to make this known, to ensure that Amanda faced accountability, then she would use it. As Sarah disappeared into the galley to fetch the airline staff, Elaine glanced at the other passengers, who were now staring at her with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. She could sense their eyes on her, their silent questions. Who was she? Why was she standing up? Was this going to be a fight? Elaine's response was simple: she was not here to fight. She was here to ensure that respect, human dignity, was restored, not just for herself, but for everyone who would board an airplane, or step into any space, and encounter prejudice in the future. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing this for all those who didn't have the platform or the voice to stand up. Moments later, Sarah returned with two men in tow, Captain Roberts and a gate supervisor. The captain was a tall man with a stern expression, his uniform crisp and well-pressed. The gate supervisor was shorter, more nervous, his hands wringing together as he approached Elaine. "Ma'am, what seems to be the issue?" Captain Roberts asked, though his eyes quickly flicked toward Elaine's torn dress. He took in the situation, Elaine's poised composure, the flight attendant Amanda standing in the background, and the growing tension among the passengers. "This is a matter of misconduct by one of your flight attendants," Elaine said, her voice unwavering. "A flight attendant by the name of Amanda Walsh has made multiple discriminatory remarks toward me, culminating in physical aggression. Not only did she tear my clothing, but she did so with the intention of humiliating me." Captain Roberts' eyes widened, and he turned toward Amanda, who had now taken on a defensive posture, her arms crossed tightly. "Amanda, is this true?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Amanda shifted uncomfortably. She started, but Elaine interrupted her, her voice sharp. "Let's not waste any time," Elaine said. "I'm not here to listen to excuses. I'm here to ensure that this doesn't happen again, to anyone." The flight attendant's eyes narrowed, and the atmosphere in the cabin became tense. Elaine wasn't the kind of person who took disrespect lying down. She wasn't going to let Amanda's actions slide, and she wasn't going to let them be justified by some misguided notion of authority. Captain Roberts looked at Elaine for a long moment, and then, without a word, he turned toward the supervisor and signaled for Amanda to follow. As the two men walked away with the disgraced flight attendant, Elaine took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. The battle wasn't over yet, but in that moment, Elaine knew that she had done what was necessary. The passengers on the plane watched silently as the scene unfolded. For some, this was a moment of silent admiration for Elaine's unyielding stance against injustice. For others, it was a stark reminder of the prejudices that still existed in the world, even in places as seemingly mundane as an airplane. Elaine was more than just a passenger. She was a symbol of resistance, of justice, and of the power to stand up, even in the face of adversity. The ripple effect. The flight landed in New York without further incident, though the tension aboard the plane lingered long after the wheels touched down on the runway. As the passengers began to disembark, many of them exchanged whispers, some lingering in hushed groups near the gate, sharing the details of what had unfolded just hours before. It was clear that Elaine Patterson's composed response to Amanda Walsh's shocking behavior had not only made an impact on the passengers but had also sparked a ripple of conversation that would spread far beyond the confines of the airplane. Elaine, however, had no interest in the chatter that would follow her actions. She wasn't looking for fame or attention, she had done what she believed was necessary. But as she stepped off the plane and entered the terminal, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in her. She had witnessed the power of standing up for what was right, and it wasn't just about confronting Amanda or the airline. It was about the message it sent, the realization that every single person, regardless of race, background, or position in life, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Elaine was met at the gate by a representative from the airline, who had been waiting for her since the moment the plane landed. His demeanor was apologetic, though there was a palpable tension in his posture, knowing full well that he was about to address a woman who was not only a respected Supreme Court justice but also someone who had been treated with blatant disrespect. "Justice Patterson," the representative said, his voice tentative, "on behalf of the airline, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for the incident earlier. We are investigating the matter fully, and I assure you that appropriate action will be taken." Elaine didn't acknowledge the apology immediately. Instead, she observed the representative carefully, her eyes sharp behind the dark sunglasses she had donned to avoid unwanted attention. She knew the airline's apology was a formality, a gesture to cover their tracks. What mattered now was ensuring that Amanda Walsh faced the consequences of her actions, and that other passengers would be able to board flights without fearing that they would be treated in a similar way. "Thank you for your words," Elaine said, her voice calm but unwavering. "But I am not interested in formal apologies. What I need to know is how you are going to make sure that this never happens to another passenger again, especially to anyone who doesn't have the platform to fight back." The representative shifted uncomfortably but nodded. "I understand. I'll make sure to escalate the matter to our senior management team. You have my word that we'll look into this thoroughly." Elaine stood still for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "I trust you will," she said simply, before turning to leave. She didn't need to say more. She didn't need to demand anything further. She knew that her words had already carried weight, that the moment she had chosen to stand up against Amanda had shifted the dynamic, not just on that flight, but within the very system that allowed such actions to persist unchecked. The incident quickly gained traction in the media. Within hours, news outlets and social media platforms began to report the details of what had happened aboard Flight 547. The story quickly became a viral sensation, sparking debates across the nation about race, privilege, and the abuse of power. Elaine Patterson, an esteemed justice, had faced outright prejudice at the hands of a flight attendant, and the world was taking notice. As the story spread, Elaine received an influx of messages, some from well-wishers, others from people who had experienced similar discrimination in their own lives. Many praised her for speaking out, for using her position of power to hold others accountable. Some even expressed their gratitude for her bravery, for showing that no one, regardless of their title or position, was above reproach. Elaine, however, remained as composed as ever. She wasn't interested in praise or recognition. She had a duty, both as a Supreme Court justice and as a human being, to ensure that the treatment she had experienced didn't become just another example of business as usual. This wasn't about one bad flight attendant. This was about a systemic issue, about the biases that so often went unchecked in everyday interactions. Meanwhile, Amanda Walsh's life was taking a turn of its own. Within hours of the incident, she had been removed from her position as a flight attendant, pending an internal investigation. The media attention surrounding her behavior was intense, with many outlets scrutinizing her past conduct and questioning how she had been able to act with such open hostility toward a passenger. Her personal social media accounts were flooded with messages of condemnation, some from strangers, others from former colleagues. Some expressed anger, while others expressed their disappointment in a system that allowed her behavior to go unchallenged for so long. But Amanda's downfall was just one piece of a much larger conversation. The fallout from the incident became a catalyst for an ongoing discussion about how systemic racism and biases played out in all walks of life, from the workplace to public spaces. As more people came forward with their own stories of discrimination, the conversation evolved from a singular incident to a broader cultural reckoning. Elaine Patterson found herself at the center of this movement, though she hadn't intended to be. Her calm demeanor in the face of hostility had become a symbol of quiet strength. She had shown that standing up for yourself wasn't about screaming or fighting, it was about maintaining your integrity and demanding the respect you deserved. She had shown that it was possible to challenge injustice without losing your composure, without allowing others to bait you into reacting out of anger. As the days passed, Elaine continued to receive messages from people all over the country. Many of them were inspired by her actions, feeling empowered to stand up against mistreatment in their own lives. Some were from people who had been subjected to similar discrimination in airports, on flights, or in the workplace. They thanked her for reminding them that they had a voice and that their dignity was worth fighting for. But the most meaningful messages came from those who had never experienced such treatment but were profoundly impacted by the story. These were the people who, until then, hadn't fully understood the pervasiveness of discrimination or how it manifested in everyday interactions. Elaine's story had opened their eyes, prompting them to question the subtle biases that often went unnoticed in their own lives. Back in New York, the media continued to follow the developments surrounding the airline and its handling of the incident. The pressure to take meaningful action was mounting, and Elaine's involvement had placed the issue of racial discrimination squarely on the national stage. While the airline had taken steps to address the situation, the broader issue of accountability within institutions was far from resolved. Elaine, for her part, took each new challenge in stride. She wasn't in this for the headlines or the drama. She was in it because it was the right thing to do. She knew that her actions would have consequences, not just for herself but for others who had been mistreated in ways large and small. And while she had won this battle, she knew that the fight for true equality was far from over. As she sat in her office at the Supreme Court, reviewing briefs and preparing for upcoming cases, Elaine found herself reflecting on the events of the past few days. The confrontation with Amanda had been jarring, but it had also reminded her of the work that still lay ahead. The law was powerful, yes, but it was the individuals who lived under its protection that needed to be seen, heard, and respected. Elaine didn't need a reminder of the importance of justice. But this experience had reinforced something even more profound, the belief that every person, no matter their status or background, deserved to be treated with the dignity and respect that was their birthright. This, she knew, was the essence of true equality, and it was a fight worth continuing. The justice and the journey forward. The weeks that followed the confrontation on Flight 547 were a whirlwind for Justice Elaine Patterson. The incident had transcended the headlines. It became a defining moment in the ongoing fight for racial equity and respect. The conversations that had ignited after the incident were far from fleeting, they were deep, wide-reaching, and unapologetically honest. Elaine's actions had ignited a fire of awareness and dialogue about the biases that existed not just within institutions like the airline industry but in society at large. The media storm around her had begun to settle, but the aftermath left an indelible mark on the national conscience. For Justice Patterson, this wasn't about garnering fame or praise, it was about the systemic injustice that had been brought to the forefront, something she had always fought against from her position in the highest court of the land. She knew this was more than a personal matter, it was about creating a moment that would inspire not just dialogue but change. Elaine had always prided herself on being a quiet force, a woman of reason, of deep thought, and of conviction. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to navigating the complex, often turbulent waters of the legal system. But what she had encountered that day on the plane was not just a moment of personal injustice, it was a microcosm of the challenges millions faced in their daily lives. That's when it occurred to her, this wasn't over. The flight incident had been just a glimpse into the broader issue of racial and gender inequity that had long been overlooked or dismissed in the public sphere. There were still countless people who didn't have the platform or the resources to stand up for themselves the way she had. And so, Justice Patterson made a decision. It was time to do more than simply uphold the law from behind a bench, it was time to lead by example, to give voice to those who didn't have one, to amplify the message that her confrontation had so powerfully sent. She took to the airwaves, appearing on news networks to speak about the bigger picture. The interviews weren't about her personal experience, she wanted to shift the focus to the broader issue of everyday racism, the kind that too often went unspoken, swept under the rug, or justified by ignorance. Her calm, poised demeanor, so different from the angry reaction people might have expected, became a symbol of dignity, power, and resilience. We cannot continue to stand idly by while injustices, both big and small, are allowed to flourish in our society, Elaine said during one of her television interviews. Racial prejudice does not begin with large institutions or overt acts of violence. It begins in the small, everyday moments, moments that pass unnoticed by many, but shape the lives of those who face them every day. Her words resonated with viewers across the country. Thousands of people reached out to her, sharing their stories of discrimination and injustice, many of them thanking her for her courage to speak out. But it was the children and young adults who reached out to her that moved her the most. These were the next generation, the ones who would have to carry the torch forward. These were the next generation, the ones who would have to carry the torch forward. And in many of them, Elaine saw the spark of change. Elaine had spent her life navigating and interpreting the law. She understood the complexities and the power that the legal system held. But she also knew that the law alone could not change hearts and minds. Injustice, she realized, was not just an issue of legal rights, it was a deeply ingrained societal issue that demanded a cultural shift. Justice was not just about what the law allowed, it was about what people were willing to stand for. Meanwhile, Amanda Walsh, the flight attendant whose actions had set everything in motion, had become a symbol of the discrimination Elaine had fought so long against. Amanda's life had been upended in the aftermath of her confrontation with the Supreme Court justice. She was swiftly dismissed from her position at the airline, and the company faced significant backlash for its failure to act sooner. But the damage went beyond that. The media spotlight on Amanda's personal life revealed a history of biased attitudes that had likely influenced her treatment of not just Elaine, but other passengers in the past. She quickly became the subject of public condemnation, with online mobs demanding justice, some going as far as threatening her personally. In the midst of it all, Amanda was forced to confront the ugliness of her actions. Her initial defiance and bitterness gave way to regret, though whether that regret stemmed from the incident itself or the very public consequences she now faced was a question only she could answer. As the months passed, Amanda retreated from the public eye, and slowly, the media focus shifted to other matters. But one thing was clear, her story was now inextricably linked to the larger conversation about race, power, and inequality in America. As for Elaine, she refused to let the conversation die. Instead of fading into the background, she doubled down on her commitment to fighting systemic inequality. She began working with advocacy groups that sought to bridge the gap between legal protections and everyday realities. Her new initiative focused on providing resources for marginalized communities, helping them not only understand their rights but also empowering them to speak up when those rights were violated. Through public speaking, workshops, and mentorship programs, Elaine worked to create a platform for others to follow in her footsteps. But despite all the external progress, Elaine knew that the hardest work was still ahead of her. On the Supreme Court, she had the power to influence laws that shaped the nation's future. Yet in her heart, she knew that real change would not come solely from the bench, it would come from the people. She began to push harder for reforms that went beyond legislation, advocating for educational initiatives that would help dismantle the entrenched biases that informed people's everyday behavior. She called for increased diversity in positions of power, from corporate boardrooms to law enforcement agencies, believing that true equity could only be achieved when people of all backgrounds were allowed a seat at the table. The months that followed saw Elaine Patterson traveling across the country, meeting with civil rights groups, policymakers, and community leaders. She spoke at universities, participated in roundtable discussions, and, perhaps most importantly, listened. She listened to the stories of those who felt unseen, unheard, and undervalued. She took their words, their pain, and their hopes back with her to Washington, using them to fuel her work. But there was something else that was becoming clear to Elaine as well: her actions, her words, her campaign for justice, had not only changed the trajectory of a nation, they had given her a new purpose. She had lived much of her life in the service of the law, but now, she was living in the service of something greater. She was living for the future, for the next generation of children who would grow up in a world more just, more equal, and more aware of the responsibility they had to treat one another with dignity and respect. Elaine Patterson had become a symbol of quiet strength, a woman who had fought on behalf of the law, on behalf of the people, and on behalf of the belief that change was possible. The Supreme Court justice who had once simply rendered judgments now found herself on a personal journey of her own, a journey that was changing the fabric of the nation. In the end, it was not the confrontation on Flight 547 that defined Elaine Patterson's legacy. It was her response to it, and the work she continued to do, that would echo for generations. The world had seen what happened when she stood her ground in a moment of injustice, but what would remain long after was the legacy she built, a legacy of relentless pursuit of justice, compassion, and equality. A legacy of change. Elaine Patterson's journey after the infamous flight incident was marked by transformative change, not just in her own life, but for the entire country. What had started as a tense altercation between an entitled flight attendant and a Supreme Court justice on a commercial plane had ignited a much larger conversation about systemic racism, privilege, and power. And now, months later, the ripples of that one moment continued to reverberate in ways Elaine could never have imagined. The media circus that had followed the confrontation had died down, but the effects of what had transpired had only just begun to manifest. Justice Patterson was determined that the attention wouldn't be fleeting. She had seen firsthand how the microaggressions of everyday life, those small, often unnoticed slights, could accumulate into something much more damaging. She knew that for real change to occur, it needed to be systemic. It needed to be transformative at the very roots of society. The next phase of Elaine's mission was to bring attention to the institutions that needed to be held accountable. She began working closely with civil rights organizations and government agencies to reform public policy on racial discrimination, gender bias, and unequal treatment in various sectors. From law enforcement to healthcare to education, Elaine was a tireless advocate for equity. Her work was not just legal or political, it was deeply personal. The more she traveled across the country, meeting with marginalized communities and listening to their stories, the more she realized that their struggles were not just about laws but about the cultural attitudes that allowed prejudice to fester. Even as the law changed, attitudes remained stubbornly entrenched in some places, and Elaine became increasingly vocal about the need for education reform. The curriculum in schools across the country, she argued, needed to be restructured to address history, privilege, and racial bias head-on. Change is not just about what we put on paper, but what we teach our children, Elaine said at a conference in Washington, D.C. She was speaking before a room full of educators, policymakers, and community leaders. If we want true progress, we have to start with the minds of the next generation. The lessons they learn in the classroom will shape the society they build. If we teach them that every voice matters, that every person deserves dignity, then we can build the kind of future we all want to see. Her words echoed through the hall and into the lives of those present. For many, it was a wake-up call that they needed to reevaluate their own role in perpetuating or fighting against the status quo. The conversation was not only about the laws themselves but about changing the hearts and minds of individuals. Education was the key to breaking down the structures that perpetuated inequality. As part of her new initiatives, Elaine became a driving force behind legislative changes. One of her landmark achievements was her push for comprehensive police reform, which focused not only on increasing accountability within law enforcement agencies but also on creating mandatory cultural competency training for officers. The bill, which was introduced to the Senate, would mandate sensitivity training on issues like racial bias, gender inequality, and mental health for all law enforcement recruits. It also sought to create a national registry of officers who had been fired for discriminatory practices, making it impossible for them to move from department to department and continue their harmful actions. But the road to real, lasting change was long, and Elaine knew that. She spent countless hours drafting proposals, meeting with political leaders, and rallying public support. She also worked with advocacy groups, holding town halls and roundtable discussions in local communities to ensure that the voices of those affected by the policies were heard. She listened to stories of racial profiling, discrimination, and police brutality, and it only reinforced her resolve to push forward, even when it seemed like the fight was never ending. Elaine's reputation as an advocate for justice continued to grow. Her message resonated with people from all walks of life: young activists, seasoned politicians, everyday citizens. She became a sought-after speaker at rallies, conferences, and universities, where she shared her own experiences and encouraged others to find their own ways to contribute to the cause. She worked with young leaders, encouraging them to build their own platforms and pursue careers in law, education, and activism. She firmly believed that the future of the fight for justice was in the hands of the next generation, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that the young voices would not be silenced. Elaine was also deeply committed to uplifting and supporting women of color in positions of power. She knew how hard it had been for her to break through the glass ceiling and rise to the level of justice on the Supreme Court. Her experience as a black woman in a male-dominated field had given her unique insight into the challenges that others faced. And so, she became a mentor to countless young women of color who aspired to follow in her footsteps. Whether they wanted to become lawyers, judges, or leaders in their communities, Elaine was there to guide them, offering her wisdom and support. "We are stronger when we stand together," she would tell them. "The fight for justice is not a solitary endeavor. We must lift each other up and build a network of support that can't be broken." In addition to her work on racial equity and gender equality, Elaine Patterson also focused on expanding access to healthcare for underserved communities. She was a passionate advocate for universal healthcare, believing that everyone, regardless of their background or socioeconomic status, should have access to the care they need. She worked alongside healthcare professionals to push for reform, ensuring that medical facilities received adequate funding and that people in poverty-stricken areas had access to quality care. This initiative was especially important to her, as she had witnessed firsthand the disparities in health outcomes for Black Americans, particularly the elderly. One of Elaine's biggest accomplishments in this area was the passage of the Health Equity Act, which focused on eliminating racial disparities in healthcare access and outcomes. The act required healthcare systems to collect and analyze data on race and ethnicity to ensure that marginalized communities were receiving equitable care. The law also allocated federal funding to medical research that focused on health conditions that disproportionately affected people of color, such as sickle cell anemia and hypertension. Yet for all the work she was doing, Elaine remained grounded in the values that had carried her through her career. She continued to raise the American flag every morning in her front yard, a ritual that connected her to her past, especially to her late husband, George, a war hero who had served alongside her during the civil rights movement. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes about her commitment to her country and to the idea that the fight for justice was a long one, and it would take all of them, working together, to achieve true equality. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Elaine sat quietly in her living room, reflecting on how far she had come. The phone rang, and she picked it up. It was Laura, her daughter. They talked for a while, catching up on family matters. But near the end of the conversation, Laura asked, "Mom, do you ever think you've done enough?" Elaine paused, staring out the window at the setting sun. She thought about the work she'd done, the countless meetings, the legislation, the speeches, and the lives she'd touched. She thought about the movement she had helped to ignite and the challenges that still lay ahead. "No," Elaine said finally, a smile creeping onto her face. "There's always more to do. But I'm not tired. Not yet." And that was the key to Elaine Patterson's legacy. It wasn't about one victory or one moment of triumph, it was about a lifetime of tireless work and an unwavering commitment to justice. She had not only fought for the law, she had fought for the soul of the nation. And though her journey was far from over, the seeds she had planted would continue to grow long after she had left the stage.